Even though tight end scoring has been up across the league in 2025, there's still only a couple of guys that we feel really good about starting every single week. And maybe now you find yourself in a position where you need to stream somebody. Maybe you have George Kittle and he's on a bye. Maybe you've been dealing with injuries. Tucker Kraft, Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, maybe he'll make his way back this week, but he's missed the last several games. Or maybe you dropped all of your fab on Oronde Gadsden thinking he was going to lead you to the promised land, and now he's disappeared on you. Whatever the reason may be, we've got you taken care of here in our tight end start and sit matchup analysis. Let's start on Thursday Night Football with the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions. Spoiler alert, there's only one guy to talk about here. Jake Ferguson has lost a ton of his upside since CeeDee Lamb came back, so he's not giving you the same type of performances that were winning you weeks back at the beginning of the season. But he still has a decently solid floor, especially over the last 4 games when he has averaged 6 targets per game. Detroit's done a pretty solid job against tight ends, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to the position. Jake Ferguson, once again this week is a guy, 6 targets. We could lock him in for a floor of like 6-7 fantasy points. And as of right now, Brock Wright is questionable. Just for a second, listen to these names that played tight end last week for the Detroit Lions. Anthony Firkser, remember that name? Ross Dwelley, remember that name? Firkser caught a pass for the first time in 3 years in the NFL. Things are not looking good for the Lions right now. Seattle has a really tough matchup going up against the Atlanta Falcons, and AJ Barner is going to be a sit for me. Atlanta is only allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and AJ Barner has been up and down all season long. On top of that, given the fact that JSN had a really bad game last week, would not be shocked if they force feed him this week to get him going once again. I just can't rely on AJ Barner. The one area that Seattle is allowing a decent amount of fantasy points to is the tight end position. Right now, they have allowed the 4th most. And Kyle Pitts is coming off of a game in which he caught 7 of 8 targets for 82 receiving yards. Why can't Kyle Pitts do that on a weekly basis? Solid matchup. Always a risky play though. For Cincinnati and Buffalo, this position now for the Bengals is very similar to the position for the Pittsburgh Steelers. You never really know who you're going to get at this point in time. Cincinnati right now is rotating 4 tight ends at the position. Gesicki, Fant, Tanner Hudson, and Drew Sample. And it's a tough matchup. Buffalo allows the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. So for me, I'll go ahead and stay away from Cincinnati once again this week. But for Buffalo, if Dalton Kincaid can come back this week, he has a chance to absolutely eat. Cincinnati is giving up more fantasy points to the tight end position than any team ever. That's right. Cincinnati is on pace to allow more fantasy points to the tight end position this season than any team ever. If you have a tight end against Cincinnati, you roll with them. And hopefully, Dalton Kincaid can be healthy and on the field this week. Because if he can, he could end up having a really big day. But if Dalton Kincaid misses yet again, Dawson Knox should find the end zone based on what we've seen recently. For the Tennessee and Cleveland matchup, I have no interest in Tennessee this week whatsoever. It's been like that for a majority of the season. Last week, it was a solid potential matchup and didn't really get a whole lot from them. In this matchup, I'm not really interested in it. Tennessee allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to the position. David Njoku saw 2 targets last week. I'll take Harold Fannin that continues to lead the team in targets each week. Zach Ertz had a huge week last week, and it felt like really the first time that Marcus Mariota has been locked in on him all season long. 13 targets, 10 receptions, over 100 receiving yards. And hopefully this week we see a little bit more of the same, because last week Denver's a tough matchup on the outside for wide receivers. Minnesota is also a tough matchup on the outside for wide receivers. So whether it's Jaden Daniels or Marcus Mariota, still can't go with Zach Ertz being a safe option, but I do think he is an option nonetheless. TJ Hawkinson had his best game of the season last week, and now he gets Washington that allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and I could care less. It sounds like J.J. McCarthy is going to end up being back this week. Because of that, I would expect J.J. McCarthy to go back to spreading the ball around a little bit more than what we saw from Max Brosmer last week. Miami at the New York Jets, and Darren Waller ended up being activated before their game last week and had an okay day. Not the ceiling that we saw from him earlier in the season, but I think he could get back to that very soon, especially in a matchup like this. Darren Waller, to me, is still a fringe start because there's nothing about his safety as of right now. But if he can get going again with some high upside, we can go back to starting him every week. And even though Miami is allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, Mason Taylor hasn't been it. For whatever reason, they will just not look his way. Even Tyrod Taylor, a guy that's known for targeting his tight ends in the past, still not looking to Mason Taylor. For whatever reason, he's just not being utilized in the game plan. Never, ever, ever, ever. It's never going to happen again. For those of you that want to continue to give me a hard time about Taysom Hill, you can take your opinion and you can shove it. Okay, I apologize. I got a little carried away there. But if you've been a member of this channel for a while, you know that I'm not a big fan of Taysom Hill. And I went out on a limb last week based on the fact that he got 10 carries the week before after Alvin Kamara went down and listed him as a potential fantasy option. And he didn't do anything, which is what he does a majority of the time. It's what Taysom Hill is best at, doing nothing a majority of the time. Juwan Johnson is going to be a start for me. 16 combined targets over the last couple of weeks and still continues to give us a safe floor. And for Cade Otton, we're going to go ahead and move away from him with Emeka Egbuka, with Chris Godwin, Tez Johnson, Bucky Irving being back. There's just not enough volume left over for Cade Otton at this point, who's primarily just going back to being a blocking tight end. Not a ton of volume last week for Tyler Warren, but he still found the end zone. And he still continues to be one of the better options at the tight end position, even as a rookie, something you don't find all that often. And now this week, he gets a great matchup against Jacksonville, allowing the second most fantasy points per game. But this is also a great matchup for Brenton Strange. Since he returned from his injury, he has been fantastic. He's been the tight end 5 in half PPR leagues each of the last 2 weeks, and now a matchup with Indianapolis, allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game, makes him another must-start tight end this week. Pittsburgh at Baltimore, and I'm going to list Darnell Washington as a fringe start, and I feel terrible about it, but I really feel like Darnell Washington may be the go-to guy for Mason Rudolph if he ends up being the quarterback this week. If Mason Rudolph doesn't start and Aaron Rodgers finds a way to play this week, then Darnell Washington is a sit, and it's not a great matchup. Baltimore allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Mark Andrews should have a solid week. Last week, it was Isaiah Likely, and he fumbled the ball out of the end zone and turned it over on what would have been a big-time touchdown. Maybe Mark Andrews will get that look instead this week. Evan Ingram finally had a fantasy-worthy performance. I'm so glad that came when everyone had probably already dropped him and definitely wasn't starting him. This week, going up against Las Vegas, 3rd fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. I don't expect Evan Ingram to put up back-to-back weeks like that. Last week, the Washington Commanders really utilized Zach Ertz against Denver to keep the ball from going outside near their cornerbacks too often. This week, we could expect a lot from Brock Bowers as well. It also helps that Brock Bowers is by far the best weapon on this team right now. I said it last week and I'll say it again this week. Colston Loveland is going to be the type of tight end that for the rest of the season doesn't get a ton of volume. He's going to get 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 targets a game. It's what he does after the catch that you need to bet on if you want to play him. At one point, he was averaging over 12 yards per reception, which is fantastic for a tight end. And if he's only catching the ball 4 or 5 times a game, that's still more than enough to give him fantasy value. But he's got to get those targets and he's got to turn them into big plays more consistently before we can trust him. This should be a really solid matchup for Luke Musgrave, but let's face it, Luke Musgrave has been nothing close to Tucker Kraft since he went down with his injury. Luke Musgrave is barely splitting snaps right now at the tight end position, let alone taking over the tight end position. Colby Parkinson, for the first time in 3 games, couldn't find the end zone last week, but he's got a solid matchup this week going up against Arizona, currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. He's not going to be a tight end that's going to go out and get you 6 to 10 targets a game. We're talking about 4 or 5 targets a game. But outside of Devontae Adams, Matthew Stafford's looked to Colby Parkinson quite a bit in the red zone as of recent. What do you want to say about Trey McBride? He's the best tight end in the game right now. He's the best in terms of volume, production, and now that he has Jacoby Brissett, touchdowns as well. Trey McBride is a must start and the #1 tight end. After being a complete letdown a couple of weeks ago, Dalton Schultz did get back to 8 targets last week, and he caught 7 of them. But he wasn't even a top 12 tight end because he only turned 7 receptions into 55 receiving yards. And this week against Kansas City, allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to tight ends, I could see some of the same things. Maybe 4, 5, 6 targets this week, but unfortunately, I don't expect a whole lot of big plays, so it's going to keep his ceiling really low. And this is why Dalton Schultz is my Harry's Clean It Up tight end of the week. This is definitely a guy that from a fantasy perspective, we need a little bit more from. And he was doing a decent job of giving us a solid floor for a while, but for fantasy owners that were looking to utilize him, they want to be able to do it again this week. And if Dalton Schultz can get himself #2 in targets on this team, #3 in targets on this team, just give us a few more big plays to increase that ceiling and that floor. And if you know somebody in your life that needs to clean it up as well, just like I did last week, then Harry's is definitely where you want to go. And their Harry's Plus trial kit right now is only $10 when you use the link down in our description below, or code headliners when you check out. And Harry's has a ton of great products, not just razors. So you should head on over to Harry's and also get some stocking stuffers or gifts for all the people in your life that you think need to clean it up as well. And Houston's defense has been fantastic, and they don't allow a whole lot of fantasy points to any position. But at the tight end position, Travis Kelce is all the way up to tight end 2 in half PPR leagues. This matchup, where Houston allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, is not the best matchup for Travis Kelce, but he's being utilized in the red zone quite well this year, and there's one thing that we know about Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City: they can move the ball even against the best defenses. 7 touchdowns in 6 games before the Philadelphia Eagles went on a bye this season. Since then, 0 touchdowns in 4 games. And that is the life of Dallas Goedert so far this year. And with a renewed, sense of urgency to get the ball to A.J. Brown as much as possible, it's not helping the case for Dallas Goedert, who's been outside the top 30 tight ends each of the last 3 weeks. And now he gets a matchup with the Chargers, who allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game. The only reason he's a fringe start is because he still could potentially have touchdown potential. I don't love it though. And Oronde Gadsden, he's basically disappeared as well. Over the last few weeks, he's been the tight end 15, 31, 21, and 33. He's been banged up. Justin Herbert's been banged up. Tough matchup. Philadelphia allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game. Both of these guys are definitely high risk, but they are not nearly as high reward as they were at one point this season. Headliner Nation, hopefully all the tight end start and sit analysis this week is enough to get you thinking about who you should be playing. And let me know down in the comments below, do you have a tight end you've been able to rely on all season long? Or do you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to piece it together here come playoff time? Hit the like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, bell notification, hype the video, all the good stuff. We just ask that you find some way to interact with the video. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.